already.
Oh, we better behave ourselves.
Yes, I'll stop swearing or something. Hello there, Marge O'Brien. Margie.
Okay, good evening everyone and welcome to NENA Housing Week. Our first webinar is starting right now and we're really pleased that you could join us. My name is Michelle Maloney. I'm one of the co-founders and directors of the New Economy Network Australia. I'd like to also introduce Elena Pereya. She can say hello or wave and I'll hand over to her in a few minutes. Elena and I are so pleased that you could join us. As members of the Housing Hub inside NENA, we're really delighted to be able to bring a week of different folks from many different organisations speaking about really important issues around our housing, affordability, security and safety in Australia. I'm just going to share screen so I can do a proper welcome. So, welcome to NENA Housing Week, where we ask how can we ensure safe, affordable and sustainable housing for everyone. Cohousing Australia and NENA are delighted to bring this webinar to you, and all of our recordings will be available freely accessible on the websites within a week or two after we finish our series. First, I'd like to acknowledge country. I'd like to acknowledge that I live, work and play on the traditional lands of the Yuggera and, oh gosh, I'm tired. Oh, how embarrassing. Turrbal and Yuggera people in North Brisbane. I'd like to acknowledge elders past, present and emerging, and also acknowledge my deep respect for the governance system that the First Nations people of this continent had for millennia, caring for country and looking after each other. I also like to acknowledge the ongoing impacts and legacy of colonisation. As someone who's a descendant of the people from the British Isles who came to this continent in the last 200 years, I'm fully aware of the ongoing legacy and the work that we have to do to decolonise our minds and our practices and our work here in Australia. So, housing, what brings us all here tonight? I wonder why some of you have joined us and why have we as NENA and Cohousing decided to host a week of webinars bringing together some of Australia's leading experts on housing, the property market, homelessness, Indigenous disadvantage inside the housing system, and so many other problems. I was going to start my talk with a bit of a quote from some of the ABS data. I think the homelessness numbers are appalling here in Australia, but I think I was even more shocked at the fact that 2.5 million people aged 15 and over had experienced homelessness at some time in their life. And that's data from 2015. But I'm not going to go through too much data because what I'd like to do is actually just share stories from a couple of my colleagues and friends who've had housing problems in this beautiful, rich country. And the reason why someone like me, who I'm an environmental lawyer by trade, and I run a couple of organisations focused more on earth-centred governance, but I'm really deeply worried about the housing issues in this country. I've had older female friends who've worked their whole lives, reach late 50s, early 60s, get laid off, can't get another job because of their age and the disadvantage that some organisations place on elderly workers, or older workers, sorry, not elderly, and then suddenly can't afford to live in their own place. And we've got these older women, older men struggling to find appropriate, safe and fair co-housing arrangements, often in situations that are not safe for them or bringing out the best in their lives, and often representing a massive change to how they've been living. I have Indigenous friends who have got a lot of kids who tell stories about when something goes wrong in the family or when they're pulled into the youth justice processes, they suddenly find themselves homeless. When we deal with these situations and these stories over and over again, and those of us who have been lucky to have a roof over our heads, but perhaps have been unemployed and have had financial insecurity and deeply worried about where we will live that night. These are the issues that trouble me deeply as an individual and as a person in the community more generally. So it's because of that reason that we've been putting together inside the New Economy Network, which I'll talk about in a moment, a program that we hope will share with some people more information about what's going on in the housing crisis in Australia. And I'm just opening up our program for those who hopefully have registered for the whole week. Some of you may have just tuned in tonight because I shot out a note to the network reminding folks about our webinar tonight. But for those joining us for the whole week, we're really delighted to have, so tonight we've got one webinar, and then Tuesday, Wednesday and Thursday, we have lunchtime and evening webinars. And the topics we're looking at are all about finding solutions to homelessness, crisis accommodation, transition housing, through to longer term arrangements for caring for our most vulnerable people. We've got a session on sustainable housing and the climate emergency, where we look at not only how we make houses comfortable and affordable for people through sustainability measures, but actually rethink how housing and residential sprawl in Australia is impacting on the non-human community, which is obviously an area that I work in a lot and care about a lot. We're also going to be exploring what I think is a really exciting world of cooperative housing, tiny houses, citizen-led co-living, and delighted to see all of these amazing people joining us to share their perspectives and tell us about the work that they're doing. On Thursday lunchtime, we'll have an Indigenous People's Perspectives panel. We're hoping to actually have a couple of extra folks too join us on Thursday. And then in the evening, an equally fascinating conversation about innovative financing and legal models. Now on the Friday, we really invite everyone, even if you can only pop in and out of some of our webinars this week, if you are either concerned about or work within the housing sector, then please join us for the roundtable. We've got 3 lovely speakers who'll be sort of like provocateurs to get people thinking about innovative ways forward. And then we're also going to have a facilitated session. We're not so much brainstorming brand new ideas, but inviting people to pop their ideas into a couple of templates to share with each other some of the good ideas that you have, to share with each other the success stories that people already have had for decades of working in this very complex space of work. Just got to jump back out and jump back in. My buttons are not working for me tonight. Oh, sorry, folks. There we go. Gosh, for someone who lives on Zoom, I am having fun. All I wanted to do next was actually tell you about the New Economy Network Australia. For those who are not familiar with the work of the network, NENA was created in the end of 2016 after a group of us, particularly want to credit Professor Bronwyn Morgan, who's a lawyer from UNSW, and myself hosted a conference in 2016, bringing together 150 people around a topic of building a new economy for Australia. Since that time, the New Economy Network Australia, which is run by volunteers, we've turned ourselves into a cooperative. We have more than 6,000 people connected through our mailing list and through our social media. We have nearly 500 paid members of the co-op now, which is amazing because we're also busy running events and bringing people together. We've always forgotten to do any promo of membership. So we're deeply grateful if you're on this call tonight and you're a member of NENA, thank you. What we're trying to build is a space in Australia for civil society folks to really focus on challenging the dominant paradigm inside capitalism, to rethink how the economic system treats people and planet, and to find some core solutions to how we do things differently. So I might pop up a few slides at the end of the session tonight, just to remind folks about our other activities that are coming up. But just a little bit of a call out. We've got a call for proposals open at the moment for the New Economy Conference at the end of the year. We've got a research jam later this month. So if any of you are doing research, are an academic or just an activist working in a space you'd like to share your research with others, that's what the research jam is all about. We've got a whole bunch. We've got a new youth hub. We've got a whole bunch of cool activities inside our sectors. And the only other thing that I had some pretty slides to show you, but I think I'm just too tired today to find them, was NENA's really proud of its distributed governance network. While we are a cooperative, which is awesome anyway, we worked really hard to create all our hubs. So anyone who's a member of NENA can set up a sectoral hub or a hub for their local place, come together, organise ideas and activities and share with the rest of the network, because it's all about building solidarity with each other across many different sectors in Australia to try to build a better system of organising ourselves and interacting in the economic world. So that's all I wanted to say. Thank you for putting up with my slightly tired introduction. I'd now like to hand over to Elena Pereya from Cohousing Australia, my partner in crime in all the best ways, to welcome you as well.
Thanks so much, Michelle. If you do have a tiny bit of brain space, you could just pop up your lily pad picture so that these poor people don't have to stare at me the whole time, because I think it's what everybody needs right now. I can't believe it's June already, and I think this only has come together and happened because of the amazing, tireless work of Michelle. So it's been a great pleasure to work with you, and amazing to have so many great speakers joining us across the week. So thanks very much already to them for bringing their time to this week, but also to all of the effort that they already bring to the space. I'm Elena from Cohousing Australia, and we're also a cooperative. I think Jasmine Palmer, who's my co-chair, is also on the call tonight. I'd like to thank all the people who've contributed previously and continue to contribute. We have a similar organisational structure to the NENA network, because Michelle kindly shared a lot of their structural documents, and that's been really useful for us. So we also have a series of working groups and area chapters for the different states. So please feel free to reach out to us if you're interested in diving in deeper to the issues around collaborative housing from a legal finance perspective, or a planning perspective, or community building perspective. We'll definitely either have a working group in mind, or are open to new ones forming to tackle particular areas. And we're also very excited to hopefully work more closely with other similar organisations in the coming months and years. My interest came first from an environmental and housing affordability perspective. I saw the work that I was being asked to contribute to was definitely not something that I perceived as part of the solution. And obviously those issues haven't abated in the intervening time. They only seem to get worse. And so I think I would like to acknowledge the climate and biodiversity emergency that we are currently faced with. And I think that everything we do needs to, in some way, contribute to remedying some of those challenges. And I acknowledge that it's going to get worse before it gets better. And I feel that housing needs to be a central part of creating those solutions, because it's such a fundamental part of our life, but also part of our economic system and part of our social system. And so it drives a lot of our individual and collective behaviour. And I think that that's quite central in our capacity to engage in mitigation and adaptation processes. I think COVID has helped a lot of people reckon with their concepts of rights and freedoms and responsibility and obligation. And I think we need to work towards having a much better balance between all of those aspects in our lives and in our expectations. And it's one of the characteristics that makes me so interested in collaborative approaches to housing, because I feel like we need more and more people and more projects testing and iterating processes for collective organisation and action, because I feel that that's what we'll need now and into the future. And finally, I'd just like to also acknowledge the traditional owners. I'm on Wurundjeri land of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge their continuous connection to country, community and culture. I think that working more closely with each other and with Indigenous knowledge systems will be a way forward for us living more collaboratively with each other and in the places that we call home. So thank you all so much for coming along, and I'll hand back to Michelle and we'll kick off the first session.
Thank you, Elena. I think you were going to introduce Emily very briefly and hand over.
Great.
Emily is our speaker.
Excellent. Emily's up first. Lovely. Emily is from PostWar Australia, and I think she is a town planner by trade, but I think she that's only a very small part of her byline now, and she does a lot more policy and advocacy work, and I'm pretty sure she's a superhero in her spare time. Over to you, Emily.
Over to you, Emily. And I meant to say, sorry, we will be trying to stick to speaker time so we have time for questions at the end. If you do have any questions along the way, please do write them into the chat and we'll collect them. So we'll hand over to Emily for 15 minutes as an overview of the housing issues and problems in Australia. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much, everybody. My name is Emily. As Elena said, I work for PostWar Australia. The less fun description of what we do is that we are a tax advocacy group looking to protect and share the value created in our commons. I have been given the delicious task of taking you on a whirlwind overview of the Australian housing crisis. And as I thought about this morning, I thought, well, whose crisis is it anyway? So I'm going to stay at the litany level. And if I can just share my screen, please, host.
I was so busy grappling with my own, I did not. Please hold, ladies and gentlemen.
I've got a lot of images that are really rich. So hopefully, you know, to all my beautiful friends who are in lockdown in Melbourne, and the Zoom fatigue must be real, very real. I hope these incredibly image-rich slides are helpful.
I'm nearly there. I'm nearly there. Just button problem tonight. All right, you should be able to share. Thank you, Emily.
Thank you. Can everyone see that? Present.
Yes, we can. Thank you, Emily.
Beauty. Okay, yeah. So when I was thinking about this morning, I was thinking, well, differently located actors in our society tell different stories and make very different claims about the nature of our housing crisis. And sometimes those claims are competing, and sometimes they're outright conflicting in terms of the claims they make on policy. So the first housing crisis is the coalface housing organisation's homelessness crisis that Michelle alluded to before. And the kinds of things they talk about when we're talking about the homelessness crisis or the lack of access to housing crisis is the subsidy gap between the amount of money that's available to fund housing services and the capacity of housing organisations to actually house people. We talk about the shrinking supply of public and social housing. We talk about the increased risk of homelessness, and homelessness has risen in Australia. Well, it's on the next slide. There you go, 13.7% in 5 years in 2016. Unfortunately, I don't have newer data than that. We talk about the absence of affordable rental housing. So here's a lovely figure from Paulson, Reynolds and Nygaard's analysis from Mahuri, and it shows the structural change and shift in the amount of rentals, private rentals, affordable between $100 and $400 a week. And you can see that it's just gotten much more expensive in the private market. They talk about the inadequacy of welfare payments to meet those housing costs. And they talk about the lack of coordination between levels of government. So, oh, wow, here's one of my really image-rich things for you. So here we have the 394,000 people who are currently in social housing versus the nearly 200,000 people who are on waiting lists. So the shortfall is around 4%. that we need about 8.7% of our population housed in social housing, and currently there's only 4.4% of the population housed. This is a really cool one. These maps here with the lovely bright colors, that's a snapshot from the SGS Rental Affordability Index. And you're looking at one that is for a single parent who works part-time. And everything in green is affordable to rent for them, and everything in red or orange is not. So that's most of Melbourne and Sydney. And then here, these maps show the funding gap in terms of government funding for social housing in different cities. So the next housing crisis is experienced by Triple J listeners, youth, and they're whinging about or experiencing a declining share of owner occupation. They're experiencing a radically increasing deposit gap. So this is the difference between how much you had to save in order to buy a home at one point in time versus how much you need to save now. They're also struggling with tenancy standards and security of tenure. And they're struggling with the location of housing. Let's have a look at some graphs. So here's a good one from the Grattan Institute. This one shows how much you end up paying on your mortgage depending on when you were buying into the housing market. So if you're buying in 1990, you pay a lot less than if you bought in 2017. Now this is from 2018. Interest rates have dropped again, and consequently house prices have risen. So it'll be interesting to look at that graph in now. I suspect it would be a bit higher. This one, home ownership rate by birth cohort and age group. This shows you how many people are owning their own home, depending on when they were born. So you can see that if you were born between 47 and 51, a much higher proportion of young people aged 25 to 29 were actually in home ownership. And compared to, well, my brother's generation, much lower, below 40%. However, the catch here is that apparently, according to some Mahuri research, it's because we're not getting married early. And home ownership, home household formation rates have changed. So consequently, people aren't forking out for their first home at the same kind of time as our grandparents did. And we have, this great article from today's Sydney Morning Herald. Grandparents need the backyard. Boomers deepen housing crisis by staying in empty nests. This is a discussion of the change in where homes are located in Sydney versus where people who work are located, and the change of employment. And basically the journalist was arguing that all of the best housing is located where people who go to work don't live anymore. So there's a mismatch in the spatial supply, which is a problem for people who need to get to work. And then of course we have the Choice report from a few years ago looking at the fear of eviction. And Australia has a no grounds for eviction tenancy. You know, if you're a landlord, you can kick someone out of their rental place with no grounds, which is not the case in many other countries. But it means that something like, you know, proportion of, I've actually got it. A proportion of the people who are in renting private rental, they will not ask for repairs to be done or make complaints because they're scared to be kicked out of their homes. Oh, the other housing crisis is experienced by economists on Twitter who are really worried about asset price inflation and financial instability. So their concern is with things like household debt to GDP ratio. They're really worried about the diversion of private investment lending going towards housing. That is to say, they're worried about the amount of money we borrow to buy really expensive houses versus the money we borrow to, I don't know, start businesses or invest in other things that may lead to more productive outcomes. They also talk a lot about monetary policy and the way that lowering interest rates is causing massive asset price inflation in terms of housing. And they like to have a good go at the either way too generous lending standards, subprime they worry about, and very concerned about taxation, particularly taxation settings that affect investment, or rather that divert. They're worried about taxation settings like negative gearing and capital gains tax, which make housing a much more attractive asset class, contra something like shares or, I don't know, investing in a business, and consequently crowding out through investment owner occupation. And here's some of the things we've got. This is a great graph from the Grattan Institute showing asset price inflation, housing prices versus rents, wages, and CPI. And as you can see, rents have grown a lot slower than housing prices, and about on par with wages. And this graph is from the RBA's latest report, How Risky is Australian Household Debt? And it's showing Australia's very, very, very sharply climbing global household debt to income ratio in comparison with 22 advanced economies. Oh, my time is nearly up. Quick, what's next? Housing investment lending versus business investment lending. Oh, this is the other housing crisis. The built form professionals, oh my God, why did you build that? Standards crisis. So we're talking about poor environmental performance in the housing stock. We're talking about terrible apartment design standards, regulatory moral hazards that are leading us to have either flammable cladding in Melbourne or mouldy apartments in Sydney. Homogeneity and inflexible typologies, that's for the architects in the room. This is where we are building the same kinds of homes. And for example, in the inner city suburbs, 1 and 2 bedroom apartments, and in the outer suburbs, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 bedroom. Did you know Australia has the largest housing size in the world? We build the largest houses in the world, 239 square meters, the average Australian housing size. So the question is, what happens when people who live in the inner suburbs need more than 2 bedrooms? Well, too bad, there isn't that many 3-bedroom places. And we talk about the missing middle, spatially determined vulnerabilities. That's like if you live in the outer suburbs and you rely on your car and there's a massive oil price shock, what's happening to your living costs? So here's some articles. Australia is still building very, very poor standard of housing. This is the thing that got me. Before the standards were introduced, our average housing performance was about 1.5 stars. And the mandated performance of 6 stars is actually falling way short of what we need it to be if we're going to have meet any of the existential risks that are coming towards us. I suggest that you check out the website mcmansionhell.com just because it's funny. Here's some really good examples of very bad apartment typologies and an example of the kind of housing that we do not have, the missing middle. So these are terraces, dual occupancy, multi-dwelling, the kinds of type, particularly in Melbourne, you see this. Detached housing in the suburbs, massive high-rise condominiums in the centre. Oh, the other housing crisis is faced by the property industry. And this is a supply and tax burden crisis. So housing supply just cannot meet the demand. And the problem is that there's restrictive zoning. So there's not enough land being delivered to the market so the private market can build houses and keep the prices down. Also, there's a huge tax burden on property. The UDIA claims that something like 40% of, if you're a foreign student and you want to buy a 2-bedroom, 2-bath investment apartment, I'm sorry, about 40% of the price of that is the taxes and charges that you have to pay. But if we got rid of those taxes and charges, the industry argues, then we would #make housing affordable. And as you can see, the Property Council of Australia, their primary focus is housing affordability. Planning is a really big problem because if we do not have very deregulated environmental and planning controls, then the market simply cannot deliver. Yep. So with a few seconds I have left, I want to talk about what I consider to be my personal favorite example of the housing crisis that we're in. The Gatwick Hotel was a private boarding house in St Kilda. It, over the years, housed many of the most marginal people in that suburb and in that community. It was bought by Channel 9 for apparently $5 million less than they disclosed, but anyway. And then on season 14 of The Block, those apartments were turned into luxury dwellings and flipped and sold, or apparently they walked away with $2 million between them in uplift value, thanks to that move, which actually saw, you know, talking to the guys from St Kilda Community Housing, there was like 5 or 6 people that will never be rehoused. They are now homeless. So from my point of view, and from Prosper's point of view, our cultural housing crisis is this obsession with property investment and commodification of housing. And the fundamental problem as we see it is that the housing market isn't competitive. It's actually a monopoly market, but that structure is well hidden from us. And the competing claims that are made by different actors sort of cover up that fundamental nature. And that, of course, because it is not only not competitive and a monopoly, housing has these two characteristics. One as an asset, rent extracting, capital gains earning wealth asset, and the other as, if you don't have one, you will suffer very badly and potentially be completely marginalized and excluded from our community. So these are the two characteristics, and they're fundamentally in conflict a lot of the time. And our policymakers walk this terribly fine line where they are trying to avoid minimizing or depreciating the wealth that's held in private property on one hand, and on the other hand, meet the needs of people who need to be housed across the community. And I think hopefully that sets Louise up well. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Emily. That was both depressing and delightful because of your presentation style. Thank you for taking us on that whirlwind tour. If folks have questions for Emily, if you wouldn't mind just jotting them into the chat, we'd love to join all our questions together in the last part of this webinar this evening. So thank you, Emily, that was excellent. And now I'd like to introduce Louise Crabtree-Hayes from the University of Western Sydney. That's correct, isn't it, Louise? Yes, I've been getting a few things wrong. It's been quite the night. Louise and I met a couple of years ago on a whole range of projects, and I have to say I am always amazed at how much Louise knows about so many things. Louise has been speaking into NENA's short course, Building a Wellbeing Economy for Australia, and has really been blowing our hair back about the deeper elements of property, or private property, capitalism, futures markets, and to pick up on Emily's final comments about the culture and the practices that have been so deeply embedded in Australian society that do appear really challenging to unpack to make housing more affordable and fair. So Louise, or Associate Professor at UWS, Louise Crabtree-Hayes, can we hand over to you to share with us the deeper dive into capitalism, homelessness, and other nasty things?
Sure. I'll just do a share. This. Bring up me driving my new laptop, losing my mind. There we go. Okay, so does that come up? Awesome. Okay, so I'm going to go through 3 things mainly. One about what is actually going on in this whole property fiasco, which picks up nicely from where Emily left off. Then I'm going to talk about this guy called the man of property and what this is generating in terms of unsustainability, and then some further thoughts on this whole issue of commodification. So what is bound up in property? And I have got pictures, so it's not going to be there by text. but I am an academic, so I feel obliged to have bullet points. So we basically can understand that property is the codification of relationships. So what do I mean by that? It's basically saying, I own this and you own that. It's a sort of a collective performance art, if you like, sort of a implicit series of relationships that we kind of don't think about. But what does that really mean? It really is relying on this implicitly agreed framework. When we say, oh, I own this and perform that act of property claiming, there is an agreement there that you're going to believe me. That when I say that, that makes sense in some way. We've got an agreement as to what that means. There's a whole bunch of things in there. I'm separate to you because I own this, which means you don't. We're both separate to the thing we're talking about. So if I say I own it, then that's a particular relationship that's being asserted there. But the objects in question can in fact be owned, that we think that's a thing that makes sense, and that ownership is understood. So there's all this stuff going on in there that at face value, you just don't actually think about. So there's a lot going on there, and it's all unstated and presumed. So there's a lot of trading on, just expecting people to understand that this is all agreed, it's all fine, and we're all signing up for this. So what's really bound up in Western understandings of property is a whole bunch of things I'm going to unpack in a few slides. So what I want to talk about here is how this actually reflects our perceptions of the world as, in a Western colonised context. So it talks about this idea of, the authors who write about this talk about this idea of disjuncture as manifest in these property relationships. There's this idea that the future is separate to now, which is separate to the past, and that time moves from the past through the present to the future. And these are really bound up in ideas of progress and everyday time construct, which are absolutely central to that idea of property and that idea of ownership. I own this, it will improve over time, and that those are all, sort of implicitly understood concepts. So what started a lot of problems that we've got with property now was the enclosures of land, which then was rolled out through the processes of colonisation. And that was very much predicated on these ideas of movement towards this betterment, this idea that the future would always be better, which is automatically, it's like an instant fail. If the future is where the better is, you can never get there. So it really puts you on this treadmill of thinking it's always about to happen, but you can never actually get there. So it really sets up this endlessness. That's very much inflected with and emerging from Judeo-Christian sacrifice narratives. So you sacrifice now for a reward in the present. So this delaying of heaven, it can't be here and now, this can't be good enough. And so that really sets up this sort of temporal dislocation and gets people thinking about, oh, it's just over the hill, it's just over the hill. That's where the good stuff is, it can't be here and now. So it's very much this narrative in which suffering in the present is seen as a prerequisite for future reward. So it enables a lot of violence in the present as well, because your reward will come. So all of this has been absolutely crucial in both colonisation and the construction of property law. It's all implicit in those relationships that we think kind of benign and understood. So these assumptions very much shape ideas about how to be in the world. And so this Enlightenment idea of progress actually became the rationale of colonisation and the measure of civilisation. So it starts to become the lens through which people are understood, and through which people are seen as worthwhile or not, and through which ideas of value start to be generated, is whether you're signed up to this progress narrative or not. So this is Nick Blomley, who writes a lot about property, and he says that private ownership is seen as good to the extent that it fosters valued behaviours. So you're signed up to this narrative, including responsible citizenship, political participation, and economic entrepreneurship. By extension, people who do not own property, insofar as this ownership model is concerned, are treated with a good deal of ambivalence, suspicion, and even hostility. And so that's what Emily was saying before. Either you own or you're not human. Those are the dichotomies that this system presents to you. So in this, we see history as this process of conflict and change, this idea that the present emerges from the past and the future will emerge from the present. And so it's putting this positive value on change. It says that we're always moving towards things being better, which really leaves the present in this really hopeless and hapless state. So Deb Birdrose talks about it as a hapless moment, which just the present just gets emptied out. There's nothing of value here. because it's all about that future value, which is tied up with ideas around speculation and future gain. So what does all that mean? Okay, that's kind of a bit of a deep theoretical dive into the core tenets of Western civilization in approximately 5 minutes. Sorry about that. But what are the implications of this if we want to talk about housing? So it actually creates these ideas of progress and improvement that really fundamentally underpin these pro-growth narratives and assume that monetary interpretations of value will increase over time. And that's a really core driver of the speculation that we're seeing in the housing market. No politician will ever stand up and say, our forecast is awesome because GDP is going to drop, house prices are going to drop. It's just this, it's inconceivable in a Western economic and political landscape to actually get up and say that. So what this means is if we think about property as the codification of relationships, it actually only recognises some forms of relationships. So it's talked about as prioritising exchange value over use value. What can I flip this for? Not what's the function that it's serving. Is it of good in society? Is it enacting ecological restoration? Is it articulating First Peoples relationships and stewardship of place? No, it's flippable. That's what we're seeing. So relationships are foregrounded that are based on exchange and speculation rather than ideas around reciprocity or embeddedness. So it also reflects and fosters this connection between people's things and places. You can only speculate, you can only have that, I own this, it's mine, I'm going to flip it, if those relationships of connection and reciprocity have been excised. So you get this disconnect. And it also renders other ways of being illegible, disregarded, or unacceptable. So if you're not doing this, you're not actually seen as part of society. So this all sets the characteristics, conditions for exploitative relationships, which we'll get into. So why is this becoming even more problematic? Because we've got to acknowledge the fundamental violence and exclusion inherent in private property, especially on unceded lands. But it actually sets up the progress and growth narratives and the drive for instant trading of displaced commodities are actually unworkable systemic flaws, actually set up some fatal problems in the system, which we're now actually dealing with. And so to start talking through to this, we're going to sort of now segue into, well, what do I mean about this and what are these sort of fundamental unsustainabilities? Now, Val Plumwood, who's a wonderful ecological humanities scholar, talked about this person, this archetype of humanity held up in Western property as the man of property, very much gendered intentionally. And she said the man of property constitutes as excluded a certain range of others. So it pushes all of those other people out, those non-humans that aren't part of this narrative, because the concept of property has built into it the denial and appropriation of certain backgrounded kinds of prior contribution of labour, and requires the continued representation of this contribution as inessential and the subsumption of those who make it within the master sphere of ends. So what it's basically saying is property is built on the labour of others, but it has to hide that labour, and that's what makes it function in the way and able to function in the way that it does. It's only through erasing all of the labour that holds it up. So it doesn't just refuse to see or acknowledge others, it also appropriates their labour. It also takes that work within itself, and then that's what is the basis of the value that is traded. It's all of that unrecognised labour. What are we talking about when I say labour? Okay, well, there's obviously the physical labour of people who do work in the home, and that's rendered invaluable and not seen. But there's also energy slaves and water slaves. So this is looking at the energy consumption that actually goes into the physical built form. You can see the majority of it's going in space conditioning, so heating and cooling, also water heating, appliances, cooking and lighting. So that's just within the home. There's also this broader sectoral analysis of energy consumption. And in that you look at residential and go, well, that's not that big a component because, relative to transport, commercial, or transport and industrial, it's not that big. But the problem is a lot of that transport and industrial is actually generating the goods that are then consumed in these homes. So when we look at the overall consumption of the housing system in itself, that's a little bit of a misrepresentation of the actual energy sort of footprint of the homes, because it's not just about the energy of people cooling those homes, but also everything that's going through those homes, which has been very consciously constructed, which we'll get to in a sec. So what I'm talking about here is, very nicely shown in this atlas, consumption atlas that the ACF did about 20 years ago, where they looked at, well, what is actually what are the main drivers of energy and water consumption in the home? So obviously you've got food as a fairly big one, furniture, but then you've got this 25% of all other goods. So just stuff that's going through our houses. And likewise in the water, a lot of it embodied in the food that we're eating, but again, 20% just going through the house as stuff. And so that is, sort of a fundamental construction of how our houses have been built, because it was actually consciously constructed as a post-war growth strategy. So Iris Marion Young talked about this as the goal of a dream house sets workers working and keeps workers working. So this is now looking at the role of the rollout of post-war housing very much as not only a space for consumption, but an object of consumption in itself. And we've actually got industrialists on record saying that the demands of home maintenance would undermine and counter union organising. So if we build lots of houses, get people really invested in their houses, they're not going to demand worker rights. They're not going to demand better pay. So it was very much rolled out as a political tool as well. So there's all of this energy and water bound up in that, but it was actually very much constructed as a space for consumption. So union leaders and manufacturers agreed that a more spacious, mass-produced form of housing was essential to enable workers and their families to consume. So the McMansions that we now see weren't an accidental thing. They were a very conscious post-war economic growth strategy that post-war industrialists thought of, largely because all of the factories that had been manufacturing armaments were now sitting idle. And they were worried that largely men were going to return from war, really bored, and might do things like unionise or push for better conditions. So quick, get them busy, get them into the factories and produce the means for consumption of the goods that these people will be making. So it required and reinforced a male breadwinner and a female homekeeper. And the design very consciously focused on the replication of individual spaces of domestic labour in each house. So each house gets a kitchen, each house gets a laundry. It also reinforced conservative mindsets because people were too busy to unionise, etc., or organise in other ways, and provided a market for those industrialists. So it provided both the labour for manufacturing and the consumption base to drive the manufacturing. So you've got this work-consume nexus developing through the housing stock. So you wound up with some, we'll do some more McMansion bashing because boy, do they need it. You end up with this box to be filled with commodities with no concern for or awareness of the resource base. Very much just constructed as this thing for material throughput because that was an economic driver. And if you're not concerned about environmental impacts, which we weren't after World War II, it actually makes a lot of sense as an economic strategy. It's just actually deeply problematic, and we're now running up against the limits of it. So you see this absolute duplication of interior spaces and very much an internalisation of formerly public life. So where there would have been community making meals together, coming together to talk about things, it's now each housewife generally, cooking that meal, doing that labour individually with the house, the family as a nuclear unit. But it also sets up the scene for social competitiveness. They've got this massive space, you've got to consume all this stuff, you've got to keep on top of the latest fashion. So you get this, again, that relentless sense of progress and having to consume. And it was also largely driven by the oil industry. So we've got very much this road housing nexus getting built consciously. So if we go back over this terrain of consumption that's happening in the house, food, water, transport, and then these all other goods and services, we can see this. We've got a really massive problem with sustainability in this built form. And particularly when you start to see the emergence of the role of inbuilt and perceived obsolescence in driving those markets. People buying things that are going to break because they've been designed to break, but also feeling that they've got to throw out their phone because it's a year old. And so all of that very much bound up into the way that we think about our home spaces and the things that we can see and consume in them. Very much playing on the fact that we're social creatures. Unfortunately, this is stuff that's designed to make us, it's feeding on our sense of social ranking and making us feel bad about ourselves so that we'll buy more stuff. And that actually sucks for everybody, because there's been studies showing that it doesn't matter where you are on the rank, if you've got a ranked society, you're going to feel bad. Even if you're relatively high up on it, just the fact that you're in that race is going to make you feel bad, because you're going to be worried about trying to stay on top of it. So it doesn't really matter where you are in this, it will make you feel lousy. So we've got a suburban form predicated on an economic basis. It's physically unsustainable and makes us sick, as well as the speculative base. So there's the unsustainability bit of it. Now, what happens when we think about the house itself as a commodity? So this is sort of touching on some of the things that Emily was raising. Because we have got a situation at the moment which is very much skewed towards speculative and developer-led models, because it's all driven by return. So we've got this very particular skewing towards industry and particular investors and particular forms of community that are only really legible if they're interested in property rights. We really don't have this more deliberative citizen-led side of the market operating. And what I'm going to line up the shot for, not surprisingly, is to have more of the latter. So if we look at what's happened in terms of the commodification of housing itself, we've seen, and this is what triggered the GFC, was the creation of these bizarre secondary markets of abstracted financial products that trade at lightning speeds on a global scale. So bundled up packages of mortgages that are totally dislocated from the people who live in those homes, the conditions of their jobs, their lives, that are just numbers, and these hyper speed speculative markets, all operating on that presumption of progress and that presumption that value will somehow increase and will just continue to do that. And so it's all predicated on trading the imputed future value of these products, nothing about the reality of the lives of the people who are living in those homes. They were only able to be traded because of their disconnect from the places and people that were actually bound up in them. And as we saw when that crashed, real people were thrown out of real homes. There was very real consequences. This myth of dislocation was really shown to be exactly that. So it really directly impacted back onto those people and places. So we saw this catastrophic reassertion of the intimate connections being hidden through processes of commodification. So we saw this moment where it all fell down and we're like, oh my God, we're talking about people living in homes. Oops. So it's really trading on this illusionary disconnect between cause and effect. But it's recent. So, and this focus on home ownership and home ownership as a primary tenure in Australia is a recent political and policy phenomenon. It's not something that we have consistently subscribed to. It was very much underpinned by that economic and population growth of the 50s and the development of the suburbs. As I said, it's a very conscious post-war economic strategy. But we have seen this change of policy setting and a shift from the subsidisation of public housing to private. And as Emily said, we see this persistent shortage of subsidy into the social housing system, very much seeing it going into the private housing system. Again, this myth that the private housing system is somehow not subsidised and not part of a policy landscape. So Judy Yates did some really excellent tax analysis back in 2009 that showed that owner-occupiers are actually getting subsidised to the extent of over $8,000 per year through the tax system. So investors, most of whom are also owner-occupiers, were getting over $4,000 a year through the taxing system, whereas renters were getting just over $1,000 a year. So this idea that renters or social housing tenants are the ones who are the drain on the public purse is an absolute furphy when you look at those hidden tax incentives for ownership, which is what Emily was also talking about. And what we're seeing though is despite that policy favouritism towards home ownership, it is actually dropping. So the last census, we see that renting, owning outright with no mortgage and owning with a mortgage are pretty much on par now. We're seeing home ownership continuing to drop as a tenure form, as it becomes less and less affordable. So we've seen that persistent rate reduction since the 80s. And we're seeing people in, more people in renting in really insecure stock. If you really want to depress yourself, if you go and have a look at the Anglicare rental affordability snapshots that come out every year, and we get worse outcomes year on year. So I'll just warn you, the next slide is a shocker to look at. But what I want you to basically see is how tiny these figures are in terms of what is considered affordable if you're on welfare payments. And the really interesting thing about last year's rental affordability snapshot was they included the presence and then the withdrawal of the COVID supplements. So just showing what a difference it makes to people's lives to actually have that supplement in play, and then for that to be withdrawn, and the amount of people it's going to put back into incredibly perilous housing situations, particularly with the moratorium on evictions being terminated as well. Okay, so some more depressing figures, and then I'll start to wind up. Because Emily pointed out what happened down in St Kilda with the block. It's not just Victorians who know how to screw up the housing market. So I've got one for you from Randwick. So, and this was Bill Randolph at UNSW who crunched these numbers. So we're looking at this little block of land down here. There's a nice little friendly arrow on it. So it was bought in 2006 for $6 million. They bought it, they sat on it. So that idea that there isn't enough land and this is a zoning problem, it's a little bit of a furphy that the development industry likes to push out. But because what we saw here was they sat on this and did nothing to it. Very high density environment right near the University of New South Wales, high demand. They sold it 9 years later. All they'd done was apply for a DA, and they sold it 9 years later for $290 million. So this is uplift of 4,874% doing sod all, putting in an application for a DA. Okay, so in terms of speculating on future value, the reason why it jumped up in 284 million, not 184. The reason it jumped up was simply because at some point someone was assuming they're going to be able to sell apartments for megabucks on this block of land. So this totally dysfunctional speculative market with a DA approved for 750 dwellings. So in terms of, is this generating value? Who's this generating value for? Certainly not for the community. And certainly, I would say, arguably not for the environment. So, boy, wasn't that fun. Okay, so how do we undo it? If we're going to tackle that beast, here was just my few last thoughts while I was frantically scarfing my dinner before coming online. So we need to, it requires a readjustment or reassertions of the central roles of housing away from speculation. So getting it away from that exchange value into that use value. What do we need housing for? How do we foreground those core roles of it as places where we live, where we nurture future generations, where people can grow old in safety and community, all of those things that we like about housing. How do we start to get back to that and foreground that in our housing systems? We've got to address this consumption debt labour nexus that's been consciously constructed through housing since World War II on. That's only a short time. So it's not, it's not gravity, it's not, incontrovertible. We can start to grapple with this and start to think differently about how do we circulate money through our system? How do we live other than through consuming and working to support that consuming? We need to rediscover or discover the relational aspects of property. So get back into this being about a relationship between people and a relationship between people and place, rather than creating something that you can just think can be flipped endlessly. But in thinking about this, we have to think, well, who is served by this, including the non-human? What's this doing? What's this relationship about? What are we actually articulating here? We need to start thinking about past and future generations as part of those others that we welcome back into our understanding of place in the way that we choose to encode these relationships that bind us in our lives and that enable us to thrive. So really the question is then, how do we embody and promote non-exploitative relationships of mutual respect and care, rather than those really simplistic, extractive, rudimentary relationships of ownership and exclusivity? And how do those become the markers of value instead, rather than the extent to which this is abstracted and can be flipped? How do these aspects of property, which are all still there, how do those become the markers of what we see as value, and how those become what we want to see in circulation. So that's me done. I'll stop now and I'll stop my share.
Yay. Thank you so much, Louise.
Worries.
Really brain-bending concepts. We've got a couple of questions in our chat section, but I'd like to start with one myself, if that's okay. I'm really curious about the origins of these notions of future value. And I just so happened last week to give a short talk to a group of master's students about the history of land law in Britain. So, you know, the sort of 1,000 years of hierarchical structures that the British brought to Australia in 1788, because Mary Graham, an Indigenous elder who many of you may know, and myself were giving a talk about our different relationships with land from Indigenous culture and Westerners, and they were law students. So we reminded them. And there were certain points where you could see, you know, the patriarchy at play. And I'm not saying that as a woman on a soapbox, the patriarchy. I'm saying it as a legal system that took land and gave it, when the father died, gave it to the eldest son. That was in the law. It was absolutely explicit. So what I would love to know, and this is almost my own indulgence, is you mentioned, you know, Christian values, suffering now and waiting for a better future, perhaps when we go on to the next life. You mentioned the Enlightenment. But given land has always been the basis of wealth, particularly pre-industrial revolution, and then the Industrial Revolution changed the way we do business. And so businesses themselves became, you know, highly, highly, highly productive in addition to land. Where did this idea of accumulation with land come from? Or is that too ancient now to even think about?
No, that's a good one. And there's a lot of sort of writing on the Western history of property, and the sorts of relationships that have been enacted over time. And it seems that because the idea that you could actually trade land is pretty recent. And it seems to me, and I saw the comment come up about the enclosures, it does really seem to have been triggered by the enclosures and this idea that you could start to get people off the lands which they were using for subsistence, and into relationships of obligation there that bound them to someone with, you know, this particular understanding of wealth in order to secure their own livelihood. So it was this dislocation between people and their livelihoods and the means of generating their livelihoods. So the sort of erasure of commons, or the enclosure of commons, was sort of the start of that. And this, because commoning and commoners, it was very much a relational enactment of property. It was, how do we as a community access this land with an agreed set of rules around access and use. So
and it
that
was
no
never
one
sold, it was just shared and utilised and looked after.
Yeah, and there were very real consequences if you transgress those rules. So, you know, Hardin's thesis around the tragedy of the commons, his initial title was The Tragedy of the Unmanaged Commons, but his editor thought that was too unwieldy, so took out the unmanaged bit. And so we got this idea that commons somehow inherently collapse when they don't. If you don't have rules, and they do. So it was a collective rulemaking structure which was dismantled, and the means of subsistence, people was dislocated from the means of subsistence, and on this predication, well, this land is now mine and I can buy and sell it. Now, it's hard to know where that came from, but it is very much imbued with this overall sense of this kind of conflation between Christianity and particular readings of productivity, this idea of highest and best use and highest and best value, and this sort of like I think it was like a zeitgeist, or different philosophies in conversation with each other, like the whole idea of the invisible hand of the market and survival of the fittest being a dialogue between Adam Smith and Charles Darwin, and both kind of misreading each other. It seemed to be one of those gestalt things as thinking seemed to be reinforcing itself, that somehow, you know, the idea was God had put us on this land to make things better, and that there were very particular readings of better. And notions of improvement, which were very much imbued with fences, cattle, you know, these very sort of particular readings. And then it all just kind of snowballed from there as markets became established and industrialism did start to roll out. But it had that very much, you know, that inflection through it.
That's great. Thank you. And
John Locke has a lot to answer for.
Yeah. There's an amazing article by a guy called Joseph Guff looking at the changing interpretation of progress and development, but linked to use of land in environmental law, law for an ecological age. And he could actually see these judgments made where people were challenging old ideas of, you've just polluted the river and I'm downriver. And judges going, but actually, for the sake of industrialization and progress, we must suffer this pollution to progress and to have this development. And that was my first understanding of how these incremental changes brought us to where we are. But, well, thank you, Louise. Now we've got a couple of questions. I've grouped a couple together. A couple of folks were interested in this one, and then I'll come back to another one. So could you please expand on the nature of subsidies for owner occupiers, investors and renters? Where did those figures come from? And someone else has said, I'm interested in this too. Is there a helpful website or any other references with accessible info on this in easy English, not academic journals? So I think this was about the different subsidies for different elements of society.
Yeah, look, I really wish that the people who worked on this would make accessible pamphlets because I'm not an economist. But it's what Judy did was look at the subsidies that flow through in basically her main tax frameworks that she analysed were the exemption from capital gains tax when a family home is resold, so the amount of foregone tax that the Commonwealth could otherwise claim if capital gains were taxed in the same way that income, say, is taxed. So that was the main one propping up the owner-investor market. Sorry, the owner-occupied market. The investor market was more looking at negative gearing. And Emily mentioned that as well, where if you're an owner making a loss on a residential property, you can use that to write off your income tax bill. And so again, it's a way of using property as a way to property's role in tax not being collected. So it was basically her calculating the extent of foregone taxes the Commonwealth could otherwise claim if people couldn't negatively gear their properties and if capital gains at the point of sale were effectively taxed. And then with the rental subsidies, that one was pretty straightforward because she was looking at Commonwealth rent assistance. So for people who are eligible for it, they get a small subsidy to help pay their rent in the private market, which arguably just props up the prices in the private market. So again, and you could say that that's a flow-on subsidy through to an investor as well. So, but she was just looking at those tax settings basically and looking at it as a foregone tax bill that the Commonwealth could otherwise claim. But yeah, it's not easy reading, unfortunately. It would be really good to have this stuff in pie charts and to help people have conversations at the dinner table around, well, hang on, where's the money actually flowing? Because we hear a lot of demonising of public housing tenants as, a drain on the public purse, when it's like, well, hang on, let's look at, where the money could actually be used and which money is being foregone. And it's all an ideological decision. It's all levers that can be pushed to go in other directions. None of this stuff is.
Thanks, Louise.
Inevitable.
Emily, given you work in kind of the space around understanding taxation and the kinds of ways that the collective purse is spent. Did you have any comments on that question as well?
Oh, Louise did a very good job at summarising Yates's now quite old research, but someone put a link in the chat to Seven Pillars Institute page. I just had a quick look at it. It's really good. It's good overview of the kinds of ways we think about subsidy when we're talking about tax and housing. So Louise mentioned budget expenditure. So when we essentially give a capital gains discount and we count what we otherwise would have earned in tax revenue, we're talking about a budget expenditure. But there's all sorts of other forms of subsidy that we provide to owner occupiers and people in land markets that are to do with other things. Like, for example, in Victoria at the moment, we're talking about taxing rezoning windfalls. Now, Louise mentioned a case in New South Wales and Randwick where the value of the land went up enormously based on a DA assessment. And what we would say is that was actually a giveaway. It was a public subsidy. They took property rights that were vested in the commons, so airspace, density, intensity, and use rights, and essentially transferred the market value of those rights to the landowner. So that's another form of subsidy to private land holding that we don't count here in Australia very often. What else can I say about that? The other thing to consider in owner-occupier cases is the concept of imputed rent. So imputed rent is what you would have to have paid if you were renting, but you don't pay because you're an owner-occupier. And imputed rent is a kind of subsidy. Yeah, you know that old thing that everyone's mum has told them, that like paying rent is throwing money into a black hole. That's because if you own your own home, you retain the imputed rent of that property. That's probably all I can say about all of that. Except I wanted to say that PostWar should do a better job, and we should do a better job, because I think that's our job, Louise. We're supposed to be putting out easy to read, accessible pamphlets. So maybe we should do one on tax expenditures and housing subsidies.
Sounds like there is some interest in it. And I thank also Gary Flomenhoft. I hope I said your name right. Gary's speaking on Friday as one of our provocateurs at the beginning of the roundtable. He'll be sharing some information about lists of subsidies as well. So I think that this is a really interesting and important issue.
Can I make a comment?
Please, yes.
Prosper actually got me to calculate all his housing subsidies. I don't know if Emily knows this, but I calculated them and I have a whole spreadsheet, and it's about $74 billion a year. And that was 5 years ago.
Wow. That's as bad as our fossil fuel subsidies to some extent, isn't it?
And I can show that chart on Friday.
Excellent. So there you go, Emily. Prosper's onto it. Hurrah.
Thanks. Thanks, Gary.
I have another question here. Peter has asked, and I think this can be a question to all of our speakers and Elena as well. Peter's asked, if commodification and private ownership is part of the problem, how do we change it? And what would that look like? For example, I'm thinking of Indigenous cultures and communities. And of course, there's a whole array of awesomeness that does challenge this. Louise, Emily, or Elena, would you like to make some comments? Yes, Emily, after you finish chewing your din-din.
Thanks. I definitely want to say something about this, because we recently had put in a submission to Victoria's affordable housing engagement. You know, they want to build a affordable housing strategy, but they wanted to exclude any kind of, they wanted to cordon off the private market from what affordable housing is. And we said, well, you can't do that. When we talk about affordable housing, we actually have to start talking about what is the right and proper place for public subsidy. And our position is that the right and proper place for public subsidy is not to transfer wealth from the public to private landholders, because that is a financial asset. It is an appreciating asset. So when we give first home buyer grants, the kinds of subsidies that we just mentioned to private ownership, what we're essentially doing is transferring that wealth from the taxpayer to the financial asset that is the home. Now, the logic around this coming out of the Second World War, and I'm really grateful to Louise, was that we would have a home owning democracy, and everyone would have their home, and everyone would, you know, if you wanted to be in the Victorian Parliament, you had to be a landowner up until disgustingly recently. The idea was that, you know, we would build asset wealth and housing so that we could look after ourselves in retirement. And that's actually a really complex little puzzle, because that's sort of what we've done. And now, if you do not own your own home as you reach retirement age, it's you have worse outcomes than home owning peers. And we give a lot of subsidy and protection to home ownership for that welfare reason. We sort of outsource the welfare state to a home property owning space. So what we argued to the Victorian government is, first, you have to change the scope of this. The private market has to be considered. And what we need to be thinking about is government retaining land and housing being considered a separate kind of good, so that public subsidy did not go towards people owning land. Sure, own your own home, but just the building, not the commons underneath, not the appreciating part of the asset. That needs to be retained in the community, so that the community can capture that uplift that is, you know, due to lots of independent relationships in the economy, services of nature, all these things. And we could do that by extending programs that already exist. Things like Homes Vic in the Victorian context, there's Key Start in the Western Australian context, and there's in the ACT, they have this land rent scheme, right? So we feel like that is something that is achievable within the current Overton window of where housing policy is at this point. There is so much more to do to decommodify land and housing, but that was just one thing that we suggested, and we will continue to suggest.
Thank you, Emily. That was excellent. Louise, Elena, do you have other wonderful suggestions about how we challenge private ownership, commodification, etc., including, of course, beyond the initial chat from tonight, cooperatives and commoning across things? Louise?
Yeah, and well, I mean, there are so many things, but I think that I do want to kind of echo, I guess, what Emily said, because I think that these, and what I was sort of hinting towards when I was talking about, well, how do we foreground these other relationships, and what happens when you hold land out of the market and in common is you then create an ongoing relationship between the thing that's holding the land and the thing that's holding the home. And you've got that as the foundational sort of DNA of the structure. And you can do that as a cooperative, or you can set up community land trusts. There are all sorts of different ways that we can start to think about, well, if property is performance art, how do we start to change the script of it and say, okay, well, I own this house and that comes with rights and responsibilities, and I'm in relationship to society at large through my ownership. And that can become an inheritable relationship. My kids will inherit this relationship. Being in this place means you inherit relationships. And if we're talking about how do we start to articulate models that are infused or informed by the first peoples of this continent, then that's starting to sound a bit like that. Is, you know, you're in this place in a web of relationships, and there's no escaping that. And, you know, there are consequences for transgression. You know, there are things you can do, there are things you can't do. We've agreed as to what those rules are. So it creates a constant discursive space as well, where you've got to be in dialogue and working out, well, what are the rules? You know, what do we think is highest and best value? And what does that mean? And how do we identify it? And how do we uphold it? And what do we put in place in terms of what can be passed on to who and under which conditions? So, you know, it's just about getting that functionality and those objectives clear. And then, you know, your laws are basically your toolbox. You know, we want it to do this, this, and this in perpetuity. How do we set it up so it can do that? So yeah, and as you'll hear over the week, there are a number of ways and different ways to come at this. And I don't think there's going to be a singular solution. I think it's got to be place-based, and it's got to be people having access to the tools to help them make those decisions and articulate the models that they want to and the principles that they want to through learning from each other and sharing models and sharing lessons.
Sharing. I think that's the key word, sharing. Thank you, Louise. Elena, oh, sorry, Emily, did you want to?
Oh, just because it's in my head, I also wanted to mention that, you know, as part of, you know, what Louise is talking about is creating friction so that land can't be abstracted. So that's the opposite of buying a property via a website with prop tech. It's the opposite of automated satellite-based land surveillance and titling systems. It's the opposite of selling your land titles register. Cadastre matters here, the way that like property is what's a word that means kind of constituted in law, but also the techniques of property, I think.
Nicole Graham wrote a beautiful book called Lawscape, where she talks about the dephysicalization of land, which is what the Western legal system does. It just says you own that and you own that. It doesn't talk about the undulation of the land, the quality of the soils, the color of the butterflies. It just talks about what people own. And that's what you're talking about. It then gets up to that next level with technology. And honestly, I could rave about this, but this is what we see with massive corporations from far, far away, buying land and property at the top of the Darling Barker River, plopping a few young fellas in there and say, okay, plant these crops now, and commodifying the whole system and buying up water separate to land. I mean, it's like the ultimate worst case scenario for commodifying land and water and just completely separating from local community, the local functioning of people, land, water, plants, animals. I mean, it's, to me, that's a little bit of what you're talking about, this completely distant way of talking about place and country.
That's exactly what I'm talking about. The way in which those techniques of defining the thing we own as separate from the thing that is, and I'm glad you mentioned water rights as a separate kind of market, because that's increasingly important. But I wanted to mention that, you know, it becomes really tricky. I was at an Ahuri housing conference recently, and on one hand, we had a presentation on community land trusts and shared equity. And on the other hand, there was someone talking about the same sort of thing, but they were actually talking about fractional property investment. So this is where these kind of things, and you could see for the people in the room, it was like, wow, one of these things really enables the other thing, but it doesn't, it's the opposite. So fractional investment is where everyone buys a little brick, you know, buy a brick, and making that more and more possible. But then trying to find ways so that our concept around community ownership and shared equity don't get hijacked by fractional investment. Anyways, they're my thoughts.
No, thank you. And these are important issues. And just a reminder, you know, this webinar is connected to our other webinars throughout the week, where we will be talking about a lot of solutions where people are reconnecting around co-housing and shared housing, community land trusts, which is something Louise knows a lot about, and other things. There's actually a really nice question in here from Alison, just asking, is Australia much worse with the commodification of housing than other countries? It seems so. And if so, does this relate to the fact that people move around a lot more? I wonder, given, what happened in the US with the whole mortgage crisis, I would think that we're not worse than the US. But Louise, did you want to speak to this one just quickly?
Yeah, we're pretty bad, but we're not the worst of the worst. But we're up there. But I mean, most Western property owning markets are doing this. The thing about mobility is interesting because I think, I mean, it's one of those things where like, my science brain is like just running off down like so many rabbit holes now because there's so many variables in that question that I feel like I'm going to have an aneurysm because it could
please don't.
It could be tied up with demographics, labour mobility, and there's bottlenecks in the market where people can't move, and actually problems with mobility in the market. A lot of what Emily was saying with how we're seeing boomers not moving, and their houses are enormous. A lot of the time, the transaction costs of moving are really a barrier to downsizing, and so we've actually got pretty bad mobility in our market. So I think that where it is intertwined with mobility is where people will use the asset base that they've got to keep speculating and keep enabling their own mobility. But I don't think we're a particularly hypermobile society, and I think there are strata of our society who can move a lot, and there are others who are really, really stuck. And because of that lack of diversity, because we don't have things like shared equity, co-ops, rent caps, community land trusts, for a lot of people, there is no mobility other than try and move somewhere cheaper and then try to still get to your job. That's a really messy landscape, and the mobility is very patchy and very uneven. We do flip property a lot, but it's only some people who can do that.
Yeah, but I think the answer to the first part of that question about does Australia commodify housing more or less than others, it sounds like we're about on par to some other Western industrialised places. So, so we're not the worst of the worst, but Yeah,
there's sort of a cadre of us, and we're right in that, the thick of that. When you look at the UK, the USA, and us, we're all pretty bad. And it's all tied up in financial flows of capital and.
We'll wrap up in about 2 minutes. I actually just wanted to ask Emily, you mentioned Australia has the largest size of housing in the world with 239 metres squared. I was just curious, is that the largest average size of house? Because I've been to the US in Florida where seriously the houses there were, I honestly thought in my naivety at first that they were hotels. But are we talking per head of population, your average human being in Australia has a bigger house than your average person somewhere else? Emily?
So I found this article in the conversation. It was really old. It was like from 2015 or something. So I had to look it up, the current. And, according to domain.com.au, the average size of a newly built house in Australia is 235.8 square metres, up 2.9% year on year. And that article from 2015, we had outpaced the US. Seeing as we're
That's terrifying. Yeah.
I don't know if you've been to Canberra, on the outskirts of Canberra, which is where the bigger suburban homes are. But going back to that cultural point, people talk about their home squares as like a topic of barbecue conversation. It's like dick swinging, for want of a better, excuse my language, but that's what it is. competitiveness. Louise talked about it. Consumption competitiveness.
Oh
That's
yeah,
really a part of
definitely.
it. But you know, the market for supplying homes, I get really, I don't know whether this is the housing we want to live in or the housing we're offered. You know, when you go to the shops and you don't really want to buy anything, but everything's the same and that's all there is. I suspect that the volume build options out there aren't necessarily a reflection of what people in Australia would necessarily consume in our urban areas. There is only one study I know that supports that claim, though, which was the Grattan Institute years ago. They did a survey, and essentially a lot of people reported that they would prefer to be living in the missing middle. But the missing middle is really hard to deliver profitably. So
With our current systems of value, perhaps.
yes.
Yeah.
Yes. I mean, when you're talking about land in Randwick appreciating like that, that's supporting much higher levels of density.
Yeah.
It's a really complex kind of conversation, though.
It is. And it's probably getting too late on a Monday night for that. I actually just want to read out a lovely comment from one of our, I feel like I'm a radio DJ, one of our listeners. No, Warwick has just shared this lovely note. He says, I'm active in the Save Public Housing Collective in Melbourne, which is campaigning against the demolition of public housing estates to be developed as private housing. Good on you, Warwick. He says, Liam Davis, a PhD student at RMIT, made a presentation at our most recent meeting where he demonstrated that public subsidies to investors and homeowners would have built 1 million public housing dwellings in Australia over the last 4 decades. Thank you for sharing that. It's both depressing and important because the reminder, and as it's pricked up everyone's ears tonight, the reminder of where our public funds are going and what they are supporting. This matters in the economy and this matters to us as human beings. Someone else, I think Kerry has mentioned Kate Raworth's Donut Economics, absolutely. And she's mentioned Regen Melbourne, who started a beginning of a process looking at some of this. I just want to give a plug for the fact that Brisbane and NENA will be doing a Regen Brisbane, an initial fun-filled gathering on the 29th and 30th of July. If you're in the area or you want to tune in via Zoom, just keep an eye on the NENA webpage. We'll be having some info about that. And there are little Regen movements popping up in Adelaide and Sydney as well. So conversations about, well, okay, how do we take some of the good ideas and look at the actual capacity of these cities to live within their limits, etc., and social justice. Okay, so there's been an awful lot of wonderful conversations, but I think what we'll do now is start to wrap it up. I realize I had asked Elena to comment on something and then a couple of us got carried away with chatting. So Elena, was there any other things you wanted to add to our conversation tonight before we say goodbye?
No, that's fine. The conversation was so interesting. I think I would only add that we have a serious problem with sort of feedback loops and the flow-on effects for the cost of housing and those subsidies includes things like building roads and infrastructure, and that's a different element of that mobility conversation, because when people can't move house, they end up stuck in their car. But the flow-on of that is that they have these huge costs for their houses, which means then the only thing that they really have an opportunity to push back against is rates. And arguably, that's the closest thing we have in the kind of funding of the things that we hold in common. And so we're really continually setting people against each other and the mechanisms that might help facilitate that amenity, and continuing to funnel it back into private activity. And so if we can shift it, I think it really then opens up so much more potential in people having the time and energy to then invest in that other commodification sort of behavior in terms of co-care and mutual aid and actually those processes for managing the commons, which I think brings it back to how do we sort of work better together in this space rather than becoming singularly focused on all the crap that we can put in our massive houses.
That's right. What a wonderful way to end the evening. Thank you, Elena. And I just want to remind everyone that tomorrow lunchtime, we have a session on finding solutions, homelessness, crisis accommodation and transition housing. And then in the evening, we have caring for our most vulnerable. We've got some really amazing speakers and I'm looking forward to both sessions. And I just noticed someone was jotting some questions, and I'm so sorry we don't have time for all of them, about the trap we're in institutionally and financially. So you might be interested in the session later in the week about financial solutions to shifting the housing problems that we have. But yes, it is a tricky and very deep problem in our current culture. But I'm very encouraged by the work that I've certainly had the good fortune to be seeing over the last few years in our work within NENA, is watching all of you guys and other amazing people, you know, really breaking down these barriers and at least analysing and discussing it. So, okay, so on that note, I want to huge thank you. Emily, can you guys still stay on mute, please? Someone's jumped off mute and they're crackling. I'm just trying to rescue the moment. I just want to give a huge thank you to Louise Crabtree-Hayes and Emily Sims for kicking off our discussions this evening in such a wonderful way. So I often say, give them a daggy air clap, la la la, or press your little clap button. Thank you so much, lovely ladies. Oh, we've had an all ladies session tonight. How interesting. I shall not go further into that. But yeah, thank you so much to all of you for spending your Monday night with us. And I hope to see some of you or all of you again tomorrow when Elena and I roll out the Tuesday program. So hooray for us. And thank you, everyone. Good night, sleep tight, and we'll see you tomorrow. Bye.